everybody. My name is Hannah Heath. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I use identity first language. I am a young woman wearing a white t shirt and I have black hair with like a magenta streak in the front. I am a member of the Disability Coalition of Cal Poly, and I'm here today with Regina Hawker and Raina Knowles to discuss accessible in person events. All of our slides have a green background with white text, and we will be reading all of the text to you and describing all of the images to you. And this is for the purpose of making all of our slides and this entire presentation accessible to those who are blind or low vision. So first, before we get started on this presentation, I did want to mention that we've divided this presentation up into types of access, such as mobility access, sensory access. But I did want to note that this isn't actually generally how disability works. Oftentimes, somebody who has maybe a mobility disability might also have an auditory disability or a visual disability. So we've divided things out by disability to try to make them easier for you all to absorb. But I did want to encourage you all to think about disabilities more as something that's very interconnected rather than disabilities being very separate like this. With that being said, let's talk about mobility access. One of the important things with mobility access is to always use ramps and curb cuts and to avoid grassy areas, gravel, and soft dirt. The reason behind this is because this makes transportation accessible to those who use mobility aids. So things like gravel or soft dirt are essentially, if you use a mobility aid such as a wheelchair or a rollator, then the wheels are going to get stuck. So that is not accessible and can cause huge problems for people who use mobility aids. The same goes for grassy areas. So it's best to try to use hard surfaces like concrete, and also always make sure that you're using ramps or curb cuts. Even if somebody looks like they don't need that type of access, it's always important to not assume that, because somebody might not have a mobility aid, but they might have something going on with their knees that makes it difficult for them to step off of a curb or walk upstairs. They might have a heart condition that makes stairs difficult, so ramps and curb cuts are always the way to go. Along those lines, it's always important to use elevators, as this is accessible to those with mobility-related disabilities. And again, like before, even if you think the person that you're with doesn't need this, it's always best to go with elevators. So don't think, oh, this person looks like they don't have a disability, so we can take the stairs. Use an elevator or ask if somebody prefers to use an elevator. Next up is to know where accessible bathrooms are. Unfortunately, here at Cal Poly, as well as many other places, not all buildings or floors have accessible bathrooms. So it's always important to double check. You can do this by Googling. There are maps of accessible bathrooms at Cal Poly. And if you're going somewhere that isn't Cal Poly, you can call ahead and check and make sure that you have specific questions to ask, because some places might think that their bathrooms are accessible, but they're not. So you might have to have a list and ask, do you have stairs leading to the bathroom? Do you have a large stall? Are the doors wide enough for a wheelchair to fit through? So that way you make sure that the bathroom is indeed accessible. Next, you want to limit and have alternatives for activities that require running or jumping, as this is inaccessible for a variety of people. So you never want to be excluding somebody from an activity because they're not able to move their bodies the way that an abled person would be expected to be able to move their body. So it's always important to have alternatives and make sure that those alternatives are equal to the more vigorous physical activities. Because it is really unpleasant as a disabled person to have the accessible event be something that was clearly thrown together last minute and that is not as enjoyable. So do make sure that those are equal.
Hello, everybody. My name is Regina Hawker. My pronouns are she, they. I use identity first language, and I have long brown hair, and I'm wearing a gray blazer, and I have white walls behind me. So I'm going to talk a little bit about sensory access, and as someone who deals with sensory symptoms with personal experience, I can tell you that these are all very, very important, even if as an abled person, someone might not deem them quite as important, but as someone who deals with them, they are very vital to everyone being able to participate fully and have equal access. So the first thing you want to think about is not having any bright or flashing lights. These can trigger seizures and sensory overload in people. And even if you are not necessarily like going to an event that has flashing lights, if you are walking by something that's happening on campus or going through an area with bright flashing lights, that can be a major issue. So be aware of that and don't put them in any of your presentations. And if you're doing something with a performance, check ahead and make sure that it's accessible for people. Also, being aware that there's no blaring music and not gathering in like loud, noisy spaces. This can also trigger sensory overload, and it can be really hard for people to understand and process everything that's happening around them. So, making sure that you're staying in more quiet areas and staying away from having music playing while you're doing things. Um, don't require hugging or any type of physical contact. So, some people can find physical contact to be uncomfortable or physically painful, and it is a boundary of consent. So, as we talk about consent with sexual harassment and sexual assault, that's also pertinent to people with disabilities. And a lot of times, the consent of people with disabilities is not prioritized with things even like touching mobility aids, touching people. You just want to make sure that you're not forcing any kind of physical contact and it's not just blanket expected of people. So just to weave that into what you're doing, that it's not expected to have any sort of physical contact. Also, avoid wearing strongly scented lotion, perfume, cologne, anything like that. A lot of people can also still get sensory overload from that. It can trigger migraines. It can have issues with allergic reactions. So just to make sure that what you're wearing is being cognizant of the people that you're being around, and you don't want to cause anybody to have discomfort, pain, sensory overload, anything like that. So just to be really cognizant of that. And now we're going to talk about visual and auditory access. So first thing, provide verbal image descriptions. This makes your surroundings and visuals accessible to people who are blind and low vision and have visual processing symptoms. It's sort of, like what we were doing at the beginning of the presentation and how we've been describing ourselves, how we look like, our space, our slides, all of that. You want to make sure everybody has the important information that they need to know what's happening and to give them a place and a grounding in what's going on. Practice giving clear, specific directions. This is important for everyone, first of all. I think we can all relate to having unclear or confusing directions that leaves us just at a loss for what we're supposed to do or where we're supposed to go or what's going to be happening. And it's especially important if you're having people do things and you have people who are blind or low vision or with various sensory or visual or auditory processing. You want to make sure that you have your directions very clear and easy to follow. You also want to make sure that you're avoiding announcements in noisy areas. This is inaccessible to people who are deaf, hard of hearing, have auditory processing symptoms, and so many others. There are so many abled people who struggle to understand what's happening when announcements are happening in noisy areas. So, blanket statement for everyone involved, it is easier and better and more accessible to find a quiet little secluded area to give announcements and directions to make sure everybody's on the same page. And also, always be directly facing the person or people you're speaking to. A lot of people use lip reading, people who are deaf, hard of hearing, have auditory processing symptoms. Um, and a lot of people also get context clues from body language and the way that your mouth is moving and everything. So, to ensure that everyone has a equal understanding and has all the access to the information that they need, don't give directions while you're walking away from people. Or if you're on a tour or something, make sure that you're stopping and making sure people can see you and read your lips and understand everything that you're conveying.
Hi, my name is Reina. My pronouns are she, her. I have dark black brown hair in a ponytail, a white t shirt, and glasses on right now. I'm going to be talking about health access and how we can increase our health accessibility on campus in our events. So it's important to allow for and to model in your events frequent breaks. And the reason for this is that it creates an accessible and welcoming environment to those with pain, fatigue, sensory processing symptoms, and more. So it's important to make sure that you have frequent breaks in your programming. Additionally, it's important to give access to any schedules that you make for this event as soon as possible. And this allows some people with disabilities to arrange for accommodations and for disability related self care. For example, for someone who's dealing with a lot of fatigue, it's important for them to know what their schedule is going to be so they can know if it's going to be strenuous for them and if they might need to rest before and after in order to be able to participate. Also, it's important to provide sufficient time between your activities and events. This also allows for breaks, like we mentioned earlier, and for disability related self care. And it's more accessible to neurodivergent people and to people with mobility disabilities. This is especially important for people with mobility disabilities if you're going from different locations so that they're able, if especially if they're in a wheelchair, for example, it might take them a bit longer so that they're able to get there as well as everybody else. And lastly, this is something that's near and dear to me, is to be mindful of food allergies. So if you're offering snacks, it's important to point out potential allergens. And if you're providing meals, especially, it's important to inform everybody about what you're providing and if there are potential allergens, because for an individual like myself who has allergies, they might not be able to eat said food and they might need to pack something themselves. So it's important to make sure everybody knows what they will be provided and if they need to accommodate for themselves.
And that concludes our talk on accessible in-person events. If you want more information about disability awareness, education, accessibility, or would like to learn about resources available to disabled Cal Poly students, you can follow the Disability Coalition of Cal Poly on Instagram, and that's our tag. It's at disabilitycoalition.cp.